You remember the sound first, not the fire, not the smoke, not even the collapse, the sound. A sound so impossibly wrong that your brain refuses to categorize it. Somewhere between metal tearing apart and the sky itself cracking open. You hear people screaming, but even that feels distant, like your mind muted reality to protect itself. Because in moments like that, the human brain does something strange. It doesn't experience history. It experiences interruption. 1 second, you're thinking about coffee, about work, about traffic, about the meeting you're late for, about ordinary things so small they almost feel embarrassing now. And then the world changes before your eyes. Not gradually, not philosophically, instantly. And the terrifying part is, you don't understand it yet. At first, it doesn't even feel real. You watch people stop in the street and stare upward with their mouths slightly open, like they're trying to understand a language they've never heard before. Papers drift through the air like snow. Sirens start multiplying in every direction. Someone nearby says, "It was probably an accident," because your brain wants explanations, normal explanations, safe explanations. The mind will do almost anything to preserve the illusion that reality is stable. But then the second plane hits, and deep down, before anyone says it out loud, you already know. This isn't an accident. This is the moment innocence leaves the room. You don't realize it immediately. Trauma doesn't arrive with philosophical clarity. It arrives fragmented, disorganized, loud, then numb. Especially numb. That's what nobody talks about enough. You expect yourself to cry, to panic, to collapse emotionally. But instead, you just stare. You keep staring because your nervous system cannot process something that large all at once. So it delays it. The human mind has limits, and sometimes reality exceeds them. You look around and everyone has the same expression. Thousands of people standing together, yet completely alone inside their own heads. The strange part is, time changes during catastrophe. Seconds stretch unnaturally long. Tiny details burn themselves into your memory forever. The color of the sky, the smell of smoke mixed with fuel, someone dropping their phone, dust settling onto a parked car, a stranger grabbing your shoulder for balance. Your brain records everything because it thinks survival depends on remembering. And for years afterward, random things will unlock those memories without warning. A plane overhead, a news alert sound, the smell of burning wires, a blue September sky, and suddenly you're back there again. Not physically, psychologically. That's the thing about witnessing something like this. It doesn't stay in the past. It follows you into ordinary life. At first, everyone talks about unity. Flags appear everywhere. Strangers hug each other. People suddenly call family members they haven't spoken to in years. For a brief moment, humanity feels painfully connected. Because death has a way of exposing how artificial most of our daily concerns really are. The emails, the deadlines, the arguments, the ego. None of it survives contact with real mortality. And for a while, you change. You become softer. You hold eye contact longer. You say, "I love you," before hanging up the phone. You stop assuming there will always be another conversation later. You become hyper-aware of how fragile everything is. But then something else happens. Fear settles in. Quietly. Permanently. Not dramatic fear. Not movie fear. a slower kind. The kind that changes how your nervous system relates to the world. You start scanning crowded places differently. You notice exits unconsciously. Loud noises hit harder. Certain mornings feel heavier for reasons you can't explain. You start realizing safety was never guaranteed. You were just lucky enough to believe it was. And once that illusion breaks, it never fully comes back. That's the real aftermath of collective trauma. Not just grief, hyper-awareness. You start noticing how vulnerable human life actually is, how civilization itself is held together by invisible agreements everyone assumes will continue forever, until they don't. And this is where the psychological shift becomes deeper than the event itself. Because the towers didn't only collapse physically, something collapsed internally too. Your trust in permanence. Before that day, the future felt automatic. The world felt structured, predictable. Even your anxiety had limits because somewhere deep down, you believed adults were in control. Systems were in control. Society was in control. Then you watched thousands of people disappear live on television while the entire planet stared helplessly. And suddenly, adulthood itself felt fragile. Authority looked confused. Experts looked afraid. The strongest country in the world looked human. That realization changes people more than they admit, especially children who witnessed it, because children measure reality through emotional safety. And once they see adults terrified, something fundamental rewires inside them. You grow up differently after that. More cautious, more existential, more emotionally tired. People think trauma always creates visible breakdowns, but sometimes trauma creates functioning adults who carry invisible tension for decades. People who laugh normally, work normally, post normally, smile normally. But internally, they're still waiting for the next collapse. That's why years later, certain people still freeze when phones ring too late at night, still feel dread during silence, still refresh news feeds obsessively during crises, still struggle to relax even during peaceful moments. Because once your nervous system learns catastrophe can arrive on a normal Tuesday morning, normal mornings never feel entirely normal again. And eventually, the media moves on. The world always does. That's another painful truth you learn after tragedy. History becomes footage, then documentaries, then anniversaries, then hashtags. But psychologically, trauma doesn't move in straight lines like calendars do. Sometimes it waits years before fully surfacing. You could be standing in your kitchen a decade later, half awake, making coffee, when suddenly a memory hits your chest so hard you have to stop moving for a second. Not because you forgot, because your mind finally became safe enough to feel it. That's what delayed grief actually is. The body keeping emotional receipts the mind couldn't process at the time. And the older you get, the stranger it feels. Because eventually, younger generations know 9/11 as information instead of memory. To them, it's history. To you, it's atmosphere. You remember how the air felt afterward, how conversations changed, how airports changed, how humor changed, how trust changed, how people looked at each other differently. You remember the silence, that haunting silence after the collapse when even the city itself seemed psychologically stunned. No one teaches you what it feels like when collective consciousness fractures in real time. But once you experience it, you start seeing humanity differently forever. You realize civilization is emotionally fragile. People are emotionally fragile. Even you are emotionally fragile. And maybe that's the hardest realization. Because before witnessing something like that, you imagine strength as certainty, control, stability. Afterward, strength becomes something quieter. The ability to continue living while knowing how quickly everything can disappear. The ability to love people despite understanding loss. The ability to wake up, go to work, answer emails, sit in traffic, laugh with friends, while carrying the knowledge that history can interrupt life without permission. At some point, you stop asking, "Why did this happen?" and start asking something much more disturbing. How do humans keep going after realizing the world is this unstable? And the answer is strange. Routine. That's what saves most people. Not philosophy, not intelligence, not motivation. Routine. You keep waking up because everyone else keeps waking up. You buy groceries. You answer texts. You fold laundry. You continue tiny rituals because psychologically, ordinary behavior becomes survival itself. There's something deeply human about that. The fact that even after horror, people still make coffee the next morning, still walk dogs, still kiss their children goodbye, still complain about weather, still fall in love. Human beings are fragile, but our routines are ancient survival mechanisms disguised as ordinary life. And maybe that's why collective tragedy feels so psychologically disorienting, because it exposes two contradictory truths at once. Life is horrifyingly fragile, and somehow, life continues anyway. The strange part is, over time, memory changes shape. At first, you remember the event itself. Later, you remember who you were before it. That version of you becomes unreachable. The version that believed disasters happened somewhere else, to other people, on other screens. There's grief in losing that innocence. Real grief. Because ignorance is psychologically comfortable. Once awareness enters your nervous system, it never fully leaves. You become more aware of mortality, of randomness, of how temporary every conversation actually is. You start noticing people differently too. The exhausted father on the subway, the woman crying quietly in her car at a red light, the stranger staring blankly at an airport terminal. Because after witnessing collective pain, individual pain becomes easier to recognize. Trauma makes human behavior more visible. You realize how many people are walking around carrying invisible catastrophes inside them. And this is where the story stops being about 9/11 and starts becoming about being human. Because every person eventually experiences a moment where the world they trusted collapses. Maybe not through terrorism, maybe through loss, diagnosis, betrayal, death, failure, loneliness. But everyone eventually encounters the moment where reality stops feeling safe. And after that moment, life divides itself into two versions, before and after. The terrifying thing is how ordinary the before always feels while you're living it. You never know you're inside your final normal day. You never know which conversation will become historical in your memory. Which hug becomes the last one? Which morning becomes sacred afterward? That's why people who survive trauma often become obsessed with tiny moments. Not because they're sentimental, because they understand impermanence now, deeply, psychologically, existentially. Eventually, years pass. The skyline changes. The news cycle changes. You change. But certain mornings still feel heavier in September. Certain skies still look too blue. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet enough again, you remember the sound. Not the politics, not the headlines, not the documentaries, the sound. That impossible sound of reality breaking apart in front of human eyes. And maybe that's what stays with you forever. Not just the tragedy itself, but the realization that human life is built on invisible emotional assumptions that can vanish in a single morning. You spend the rest of your life rebuilding those assumptions in quieter forms, through relationships, through routines, through love, through repetition, through pretending tomorrow exists. Because, psychologically, that's what hope really is. Not confidence, not certainty, just the decision to continue participating in life after witnessing how fragile it truly is. And maybe that's why people still stop every year to remember, not only for the lives lost, but for the part of humanity that disappeared with them, the version of the world that existed before everyone looked up at the sky and realized nothing was guaranteed. And somewhere inside yourself, even now, you still revisit that morning sometimes. Not because you want to, because part of your mind is still standing there, still staring upward, still trying to understand how an ordinary day became the moment history entered your nervous system and never fully left.